The Empire State Building is as iconic as Mount Rushmore or the Golden Gate Bridge. It was made even more iconic when RKO gave it a literal supporting role in the 1933 movie King Kong. But on July 28, 1945, a converted B-25D Mitchell medium bomber hit the 79th floor while scud running under a heavy Manhattan fog. In this video, we will go beyond the simple forensic explanation and look at the many factors that led an experienced, instrument-qualified combat pilot who had routinely flown in the thick London fog to fly into a building while scud running. We will first look at the people who were the principal actors in the tragedy, some relevant information on the airplane and on the building, the regulations that affected the mission's flight plan and the flight itself, of course the actual crash, and the rescue operations, as well as the aftermath. New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was a huge promoter of aviation who pushed through the construction of New York's first major commercial airport, which now bears his name. A former World War I military pilot himself, he was aware of aviation's potential, but also its dangers, and he was concerned about the lax enforcement of regulations on military flyers. His fears were confirmed even before the war, when, in 1940, two B-18 Bolo bombers collided over Long Island and crashed into a neighborhood, killing all 12 airmen in the two planes and one person on the ground. Only a week before the Empire State Building crash, 3 fighter pilots who had recently returned from combat were crossing Central Park when they decided to spend 5 minutes circling the Empire State Building's observation deck. Imagine their surprise when they were arrested upon landing and faced court-martial. This was exactly what Mayor LaGuardia had been talking about to every military commander that would listen. The B-25 crew consisted of the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, and the plane's crew chief, Staff Sergeant Christopher Dimitrovich. Also on board was a last-moment passenger, Navy Aviation Machinist Mate 2nd Class Albert Perna. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was a West Point graduate and a veteran of 50 missions in a B-17 in the European Theater of Operations, with over 500 hours of combat flying time. A natural leader, he rose quickly in rank during the war, and at only 27 years old, he was one of the youngest lieutenant colonels in the military. He was fully instrument qualified and experienced, but had only a cursory checkout and little flying time in the B-25, but by all accounts, he flew it well. The plane's crew chief, Staff Sergeant Christopher Dimitrovich, had a rather colorful background of his own. A former C-47 crew chief, his plane had been shot down over enemy-held Holland during Operation Market Garden. After parachuting out of his crippled Skytrain, he managed to evade capture by the Germans with the help of the local Dutch. This was no small feat given that the area he jumped into was occupied by Waffen-SS troops, who shot Dutch civilians that helped downed Allied airmen. He was considered a professional mechanic who took pride in his work and did a top-notch job of keeping his plane operational. Navy Airman Machinist Mate 2nd Class Albert Perna was just catching a ride home. Sadly, he was going home to comfort his parents after his brother was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. In the Empire State Building, there were 18 workers in the Catholic War Relief offices that day. It was a Saturday, so the building was mostly empty, and the workers were planning to work a half day. There were also 4 elevator operators, Sam Watkinson, John Monty, Mary Scannell, and Betty Lou Oliver. Miss Oliver was destined to involuntarily set a world record that day. The Empire State Building itself is 103 stories tall with an observation deck on the 89th floor. Its 360-degree view of Manhattan and the surrounding area had made it a very popular destination, even on a foggy day such as this one. Before construction, there had been concerns voiced by the New York Fire Department about how to put out a fire in such a tall structure. So the architects included water pipes and stanchions throughout the building to allow a fire to be fought on any floor. The fire department need only bring their hoses. The airplane was a B-25D, serial number 0577. It was originally intended for the 12th Air Force, but it ended up as a training plane at Randolph Field in Texas. In 1945, it was sent to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. and converted into a VIP transport. Its guns were removed, its bomb bays were riveted shut, and bench seats were installed. Its new crew chief, Sergeant Dimitrovich, stripped it back to bare aluminum and named it Old John Feather Merchant. On the morning of the flight, Lieutenant Colonel Smith was with his wife and newborn son in Bedford, Massachusetts. His takeoff for the trip would be the first time his wife would ever actually see him fly. The mission was simple on its surface. Smith and Dimitrovich would fly Old John Feather Merchant from Bedford Army Airfield, Massachusetts, to Newark Army Airfield, New Jersey, to pick up their boss, Colonel Harris Rogner, and 2 other officers. Colonel Rogner was a capable but strict boss and a stickler for punctuality. Smith clearly did not want to let him down. He was concerned about the foul weather, but he had heard nothing about the flight being delayed. The weather was the first real link in the chain that ended in disaster. The next link was forged when, upon arrival at operations, Smith learned that due to saturation of the instrument traffic in the area, he could not get an instrument flight plan approved to Newark. This is where things began to unravel. Now I have to take a minute to fully explain Colonel Smith's dilemma. The military and the Civilian Aeronautics Authority, the CAA, were often at odds over regulations and authority over airspace and pilots. This was only heightened by Germany's recent surrender and the resultant return of a large number of combat veteran pilots to the United States. Some of these men flew like they were still in combat, and it was giving fits to the civilian controllers. In combat, the rules were pared down to the bare essentials, as pilots were expected to do whatever it took to complete the mission and get their planes back safely. In Europe, the military owned the skies, but now they were back in America with its crowded and heavily regulated skies, especially around large cities. The military rules on flying in poor weather were quite explicit. A pilot could fly under Contact Flight Rules, or CFR, if he could maintain visual contact with the ground at 1,000 feet and had what he could justify as 3 miles visibility. If not, then they needed to file an Instrument Flight Rules, or IFR, flight plan, the very type of flight plan that Newark was refusing to give Colonel Smith. This technically gave him a legitimate reason to cancel or delay the flight, but a confident go-getter like Colonel Smith was not going to disappoint a demanding boss like Colonel Rogner over a little marginal weather. LaGuardia was reporting 1,500-foot ceilings with a forecast of 6,000 feet in a few hours. This positive forecast was a lure, a siren song that placed another link in the chain of disaster. The weather was not nearly as bad as some of the stuff Smith had flown through in England, and how silly would he look to his boss if he delayed or canceled and the weather cleared? Pressure to complete the mission, another link in the accident chain. Colonel Smith's plan was simple. He would fly from Bedford to LaGuardia under contact rules, which did not require the approval of the air traffic controllers. When he got to the New York area, he would see if the weather was good enough to proceed to Newark visually. If not, he could either land at LaGuardia or try to get a special IFR clearance to Newark. But there was one more tiny wrinkle in Smith's plan that shows his drive to complete his mission. Given the high volume of traffic at LaGuardia, the pilot of any military aircraft going there was now required to sign a form stating they had official business with the unit based there and that they were aware of all local hazards. Smith's rationale was dodgy at best, but one could sort of make the argument that it got through the regulatory loopholes. He signed the document and off he went. With his plan laid out and the B-25 fully fueled, Smith and Dimitrovich started the engines. Smith's wife Martha was there to see him off. As the engines warmed, a vehicle pulled up and a sailor ran up waving a piece of paper. It was Albert Perna. He had caught the plane just before they taxied out for takeoff. Colonel Smith did not want passengers and had already declined the request of a lady Marine Sergeant to go with them. Carrying passengers on these aircraft was a lot of paperwork, but having lost men in combat himself, once Perna explained his plight, the colonel understood and agreed to let him go. Perna sat in the jump seat, wedged between 6 oxygen bottles that were mounted to the airframe. They took off as Martha Smith watched. Everything went smoothly until they got over Long Island. The weather was getting worse, not better, and it was getting marginal for CFR flight. Additionally, LaGuardia had lost contact with a Navy transport plane whose radio had died. From what Smith could tell, it was in the area at 2,000 feet, so climbing into the cloud layer was out of the question. Smith had seen the results of two planes colliding in the fog over England. When Smith showed up near LaGuardia requesting the weather at Newark, he did not make any friends. The controllers were very busy, and the idea of an unscheduled CFR traffic popping up at over 200 miles per hour in marginal weather represented a violation in their mind. In fact, Smith could not really maintain the 1,000 feet. They put him in a holding pattern while they tried to sort things out. This included a call to the military control center to complain. The LaGuardia controllers wanted Smith violated, but they had too much other stuff to deal with. After some back and forth between the LaGuardia controllers and the military air traffic office and Smith, the LaGuardia controllers gave him the latest Newark weather, which was marginal but arguably legal, and sent him on his way as they had planes on approach and in holding patterns. He was even told by LaGuardia air controllers that they could not see the upper part of the Empire State Building and that he would be unlikely to maintain CFR over Manhattan. This was a big red flare, but Smith thanked them and headed off towards Manhattan. Another link in the chain was forged. Up until now, Smith was possibly looking at a complaint or even a violation from the CAA, but most likely it would not proceed any further. Essentially, all was going to plan, until he made a simple but serious mistake. Smith was supposed to overfly Manhattan around Central Park and then turn south for Newark after he crossed the Hudson River. The official report concluded that he mistook Welfare Island, modern-day Roosevelt Island, for Manhattan. Although much smaller than Manhattan, Welfare Island has the same basic shape and orientation, and since the East River goes up both sides of it, it looks like a scaled-down Manhattan with the Hudson on one side and the East River on the other. Peering through foggy skies, trying to maintain contact with the ground at almost 4 miles per minute, Smith simply lost track of time and distance. When he crossed over the East River into Manhattan, he thought he had crossed the Hudson and was over New Jersey. The ceiling over Manhattan had dropped to below 800 feet, and at one point he was down to about 650 feet to stay under the cloud layer. Further evidence that he thought he was approaching Newark was that credible witnesses saw him flying low over Manhattan with his landing gear down. At one point he dodged a skyscraper and probably realized that he had lost his bearings, because when the plane crashed, the landing gear was retracted. Manhattan not only had lower hanging clouds than Brooklyn and Queens, but also less forward visibility. As old John Feather Merchant plowed a southerly course over 200 miles per hour, the Empire State Building eventually loomed large right in front of it. Smith pulled up aggressively and banked hard to the right, but it was for naught. There were 18 people in the Catholic War Relief offices. Paul Deering was in his office lamenting the discovery of millions of Red Cross parcels that the Nazis had stored and allowed to rot instead of giving to starving prisoners of war. 3 women, Mary Lou Taylor, Anne Gerlach, and Patricia O'Connor, were just walking into the foyer. Kay O'Connor was walking out of Father Swanstrom's office. 10 others were at their desks. 4 elevator operators were at their posts: John Monty, Mary Scannell, Sam Watkinson, and Betty Lou Oliver, who was in her car at the 80th floor. There were numerous tourists on the observation level despite the cruddy weather. Across the street, 17-year-old United States Coast Guard pharmacist mate Donald Maloney was debating on how to spend his day since the weather ruled out the Empire State Building's observation deck. And then, boom. The climbing plane struck the building at the 78th and 79th floors, right behind John Judge's desk, killing him and Gene Sozy instantly. Paul Deering was blown out of his office window and fell to his death on the 72nd floor outcropping. The 3 women in the foyer, Mary Lou Taylor, Anne Gerlach, and Patricia O'Connor, are killed instantly as one of the flaming engines crushes over them. Lucille Bath and Mary Kedzierska in the reception area are covered in gasoline as the plane's fuel tanks were ripped open. 2 of the plane's oxygen tanks fly into the office of Maureen McGuire and Margaret Mullins. 3 more oxygen tanks land in the reception area. The nose section, with its heavy landing gear and flaming left engine have gone all the way through the building, severing the cables to Betty Lou Oliver's elevator car, and it starts an uncontrolled 1,000-foot plunge. They continue across the street to crash through the roof of 2 penthouse apartments and start more fires. The flames in the office sweep up over the ceiling and swallow up the fuel-drenched Mary Kadzierska as Mullins and McGuire watch in horror. The oxygen tanks in the reception area explode, and the blast engulfs Lucille Bath. The other 2 oxygen tanks that went into Mullins and McGuire's office explode, killing them as well. The right wing falls to the street, but the right engine went forward, passing through one elevator shaft, across the hall, and down another elevator shaft, taking the body of sailor Albert Perna with it. The flames rage to the offices and sweep into Joe Fountain's office, engulfing him in flames. As the remaining women decide how to escape, and against all odds, a horribly burned Joe Fountain miraculously staggers out of his office, his upper clothing burned away and his skin charred and covered with massive third-degree burns, but he calmly takes charge. Barely able to talk, he tells the women to go into Father Swanstrom's corner office and close the door. 10 people are dead, but these 7 will survive the day in a superheated, smoke-filled corner office, including the seriously burned Joe Fountain. Outside the office, 3 elevator operators are seriously injured by flames and debris, but 2 of them manage to get their cars down. Badly injured Mary Scannell manages to get to the John Deere offices. Her and the 2 men inside will knock a hole in an opposite side wall and make good an escape. Reports at the time said that Betty Lou Oliver's elevator car had operational brakes for some of the fall, but eventually they failed and she plummeted to the sub-basement. Some of the severed cables had piled up at the bottom, providing an undetermined amount of shock-absorbing effect. Despite this, the damaged car was already gashed and broken by debris and hit an oil accumulator on impact. The accumulator came straight up to the floor as the car collapsed on top of her, but she was still alive, albeit badly injured. She had unwillingly set a world record for surviving an elevator freefall. Ironically, this was her last scheduled day at the job as she was planning to go back to Fort Smith, Arkansas and marry her fiancé. When Coast Guard pharmacist mate Donald Maloney sees what happened, he takes action. The 17-year-old runs into a pharmacy and gathers medical supplies and runs into the building. He cannot get up to the fire as the elevators are out. He sees that one of the elevators is dropped in the sub-basement and checks it out. He finds the wrecked elevator car of Betty Lou Oliver, crushed at the bottom. She is trapped in the wreckage with a broken back and a broken leg. Given his slight build, he is able to crawl in and give her first aid. The fire department gets him a backboard and they are able to save her. Maloney then makes his way upstairs and begins tending to the injured. He is credited with saving 12 lives. Firemen also tend to the fires in the penthouses across the street. To further confuse matters, both penthouses are occupied by people named Herring, but they are not related. One was the studio of sculptor Henry Herring. The other was of Mrs. Oswald Herring. When firemen entered Mrs. Oswald Herring's penthouse, they find her in a state of total shock, and they soon see why. She's transfixed on a woman's hand in the wreckage that came through her roof. The firemen have to carry her away. When Mayor LaGuardia hears the call over the police radio, he rushes to the scene. Given the foresight of the New York City Fire Department and the architects in putting in its own dedicated multi-floor water system, the fires are out in less than an hour. The fire department also uses two-way radios for the first time, which makes the effort much more efficient. It took longer than it should have to rescue the people in Father Swanson's corner office because the fire department did not think anyone could still be alive on that floor. In the meantime, as they were all Catholic, Joe Fountain, covered in burns, tells the women that their prospects are not good and they should all do an act of contrition. The mutual prayer has a calming effect for the most part, and they come to grips with their situation. With the prayer complete, they begin working toward surviving and getting someone's attention. Eventually, they are seen and rescued. With the fires out, the investigation and cleanup begin. 2 days after the accident, U.S. Navy sailor Albert Perna's body will be found under the engine at the bottom of the elevator shaft. Joe Fountain will slip into a coma and die 5 days after the crash. Elevator operators Mary Scannell, Joe Monte, and Sam Watkinson will all go through painful recoveries but return to work. Elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver will make a full recovery in only 8 months and will move to Fort Smith with her now husband, Oscar. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. She passed away in 1999 at the age of 74. Some of the survivors will continue to work with the Catholic War Relief Service, which will simply become Catholic Relief Services. Kay O'Connor will suffer respiratory problems and require medical treatment for the rest of her life. Martha Smith, the pilot's wife, never remarried. She became a school teacher. His son will serve as a decorated officer in the Marines and become a business executive. United States Coast Guard pharmacist mate Donald Maloney will be decorated by both Mayor LaGuardia and the Coast Guard for his actions. He will eventually join the United States Marine Corps and fight in Korea, where he'll get wounded 8 times. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia will leave office on the following New Year's Eve for health reasons. He will die less than 2 years later from cancer. Eight months after the crash, the U.S. government offered money to the families of the victims. Some accepted, but those who did not elected to file a lawsuit that resulted in the landmark Federal Tort Claims Act of 1946. American citizens now have the right to sue the federal government. Repairs to the building were completed in less than 3 months, and you cannot even tell where the plane hit the building, except for one thing. A small piece of charred limestone was left in place as a reminder. A somewhat unrelated but interesting note. In 1946, a somewhat eerily similar accident occurred when a smaller military C-45 transport plane got lost and crashed into the Wall Street building in bad weather. All 5 aboard were killed, but no one in the building was hurt.